Good morning, everybody. Thank you for welcoming us on behalf of all the speakers on EauMega 2022. The dear friends, the interface of water in cities, in particular the megacities. There are land and territorial challenges which are very important indeed, linked to the extension of collective networks for drinking water and sanitation, with the creation of new neighborhoods that are further and further removed from city centers, linked to the evacuation of rainwater, the volumes of which are bigger and bigger because of the impermeabilization of soil, and supposes the creation of urban zones of infiltration, extension of drainage zones of very different diameter, and massive storage to overcome peak flooding, and flooding of districts and extreme weather conditions related to climate change. On these different themes arise a certain number of questions. What is the emergence or the impact on water services of urbanization, the dense urbanization in the city center, or more diffuse urbanization with individual homes, especially new neighborhoods, and peripheral zones to rural areas? How far then can urbanization spread in arid areas where water resources are limited and subjected to drought? What are the relations between the big conglomerations and other territorial communities and users in a same basin or dependent on the same aquifer? What is the impact of rejection of wastewater with areas without sanitation, and the impact on urban aquifers, how to prevent urbanization in flooded areas, and how to protect vulnerable sectors in the face of climate change, climate risks, and floods, which will be more frequent and ever more serious. Without being exhaustive, how do we consider the irregular habitat areas where the occupants are without any land titles, such, for example, in slums, when they occupy land but don't necessarily have access to services and are sometimes subjected to important high risks in under tents, risks related to landslides, etc. Now, in order to deal with these different themes this morning, we have four speakers who, in the order of their presentations, will be Mr. Juan Valdez, who is from the Department of Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences in the University of Arizona. We have Deepika Johari. Forgive my pronunciation, says the speaker. She is Indian from New Delhi in the Department of Architecture and Research, based, as I said, in New Delhi. We then have, we'll go to Argentina, where we will have the presentation by Jose Maria Riguera, who is the Director of Potable Water and Sanitation at the Ministry of Public Works in Argentina. And in the end, Mr. Jacques Lolive, who is Director of Research at the National Center for Scientific Research in France, CNRS, who will also speak on behalf of his colleague who is unable to join us today, and with whom he has shared the study that he will be presenting to us. Mrs. Cynthia Okamura is the colleague who is working for the Sao Paulo University and who will be speaking to support the studies with the water department of this big Brazilian state. Now, to without further ado, I would like to right away give the floor to Mr. Juan Valdez, who will be speaking to us about water as one of the driving forces, one of the drivers of the Tucson metropolitan area in Arizona. Mr. Valdez, you have the floor for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. My main purpose of the talk today is about water as the drivers of megalopolis systems, Tucson and the Arizona Sun Corridor. Next slide, please. Next slide. This map of the state of Arizona, you can see in red the two main megalopolis in the area of Arizona. On the north, the city of Phoenix, which is now the sixth largest city in the United States. And on the south is the city of Tucson. And this corridor between the Interstate 10 and further south, Interstate 19 goes to the Mexico border, has developed as a urban mosaic in which this is an area of emerging urbanization criteria that involves many different levels of authority, federal, state, local, tribal, and private developers on that part. So we feel that we need to study this at the local level and to try to understand better the dynamics of the local level, even at the smaller levels of detail, so we can understand more the dynamics of this combination of water and urban systems. Next slide, please. This describes, on the graph on the left, you have the two areas, the city of Tucson and the city of Phoenix, that you can see now with some intermediate towns in the middle, is now becoming a conglomerate. Like I said, the city of Phoenix is the sixth largest city in the United States. We'll concentrate our analysis on the city of Tucson and Pima County, where the city of Tucson is located, which has, the Pima County has about 1 million people of population. It's about 23,000 square kilometers surface. And it has a mean annual rainfall of 30.5 inches, about 12 inches, centimeters, 12 inches of rainfall per year. So it's a semi-arid area for consideration. On the graph on the left, you can see the explosive growth of the two counties, Maricopa County, where the city of Phoenix is, which is the red line, Pima County, where the city of Tucson is, which is the blue line, and the green line is Bernalillo County, which we're not studying, but is where the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico is. And you can see on the black line below is the increase in population in the United States. So these three counties have been growing at a tremendous pace as compared with the US as a whole. This rapid expansion has been declining in the last 15 years. And for example, for the Pima County has grown about 8% in the last, from 2010 to 2020, where the census are taken. So even though the population in the past has been exploding at these rates, now it's not as far, but still is higher than the growth in the United States. Next slide, please. So at the beginning, the city of Tucson and the origins, when it was developed by the Spanish explorers, rely mainly on the water on the river Santa Cruz, which actually named Tucson in Native American language means water at the foot of the mountain. But that was not sufficient for the development, so especially after the rural electrification projects and the development of the centrifugal pump that allowed to pump from deeper sites, the city started to rely significantly, almost entirely, on groundwater extraction. This has the unintended consequences that the aquifer declined about 200 feet, about 60 meters in 50 years. So definitely that was not a sustainable way to do. So Tucson joined the Central Arizona Project, which bring water from the Colorado to the city of Phoenix, Tucson intermediate areas and agriculture. At that time, this project was the largest public works projects in the country. And at that time it was felt, you can see the picture on the right, is a significant channel that about 340 kilometers from the Colorado to Tucson, and it's an elevation of almost 1,000 meters. So at that time, it was felt that the water supply problem for Tucson was solved, and in the 1990s, the water from the SIAAP reached Tucson. That caused some issues on the water quality. The salinity of the water from the Colorado was much higher than the salinity of the water being extracted by groundwater. So some innovative techniques had to be done, especially infiltration areas that the water from the Colorado was put into the aquifer and then pumped it again to try to improve and mix with groundwater to improve the quality. Next slide, please. So, like I mentioned before, the city of Tucson relied mainly on groundwater, and that groundwater was extracted either by municipal systems or by domestic wells, or what we call the unregulated loophole. On the top, you can see the impact that this domestic well has on the river. On the left, you have the picture in 1940 of the Santa Cruz River, which is the main river across Tucson. Now it's basically an ephemeral river. And then on the right, 35 years later, all the vegetation had disappeared because the water that was flowing under the surface was feeding those trees, and now it's basically a desert. The domestic wells can only extract a very limited amount of water for water supply and a small irrigation. And like a colleague of mine said, it is like a straw draining the aquifer, but there is a lot of straws. You can see the number of blue dots in there. It's more than 100,000 domestic wells in the area of the Sun Corridor, and this is what we call the unregulated loophole. Originally, there were groundwater and surface water in the West, but particularly in Arizona, were not connected. So the hydrology was differentiated between surface water and groundwater. In surface water was the idea of prior appropriation, in which basically means first in time, first in right. So there was a level of seniority, and the most senior has the right to extract the water, and then if some water is left, then the junior will have that. Groundwater, on the other hand, was called reasonable use. So anybody can pump water from the aquifer as long as it is for beneficial use. And ignoring the connection between surface water and groundwater that forced the recharge being impeded. Next slide, please. So, as I said, when that dichotomy between surface water and groundwater started evolving, there was a set of laws and regulations that tried to address this issue. But until the 1990s, what we call Arizona Groundwater Management Act, this is the recognizing that water is an entirety that should be considered both surface water and groundwater. They still has some discontinuities, but basically created what we call active management area. These are areas where the main cities in the state of Arizona are originally were 5, and now there is a 6 more, and they had to more regulate the use of the groundwater. One of the consequences also of this Groundwater Management Act was the creation of a certificate of assured water supply. So new developers had to get this certificate that assume that there will be water, will be physically available and legally and a sufficient quality for the next 100 years. At the same time, it imposes some conservation program for water. The article on the paper was people that were relying on groundwater, but as the excessive pumping, like I said, these 100,000 domestic wells start going down, then the user had to hold the water to their properties. Next slide, please. So, like I said before, when it was felt that the water supply for Tucson and for the Southwest was solved with the Central Arizona Project and similar projects in other states, we are now in a 26-year long-term drought that has significant impact on the water. You can see on the left, you have the graph of the mean annual flows of the Colorado Lease Ferry, which is the one that divides the upper part of the basin, the lower part of the basin. And except for that high peak in 82, 83, which was significant El Nino, the flow has been declining. Lake Mead, which is the largest reservoir where the Hoover Dam is, you can see the decline on the water elevation by what we call the bathtub ring. That is about 46 meters, the water elevation has done. This picture is about 2 years old. Now it's even farther down. And there's no the trend in the next 2 years is that it will continue. Next, please. So when we studied the Tucson, Arizona Sun Corridor, we looked to all this area that has a black square, which are both the city of Tucson, Oro Valley, Sahuarita, Rita Ranch, etc. And we studied in detail using remote sensing, population data, etc., and water consumption to try to do the analysis. Based on these, we created 4 types. Next slide, please. We created a multi-level typology in which we created 4 types of water users. The type 1 is the most common, which we call connected urbanites, with people that have access to water through water utilities, also sanitation, either by septic tanks or by collection of black water. Type 2 is what we call the boundary stretchers, that people that will move away from the central core, but still connected to the urban water supply in search for cheaper land to be able to develop. Type 3 is the one related to what I mentioned to you before about the assured water supply, what we call paper water and wet water. Paper water are the people that rely on this assured water supply. And finally, type 4, what we call the wildcat, which are completely unregulated, laissez-faire, which are completely unregulated developments that sometimes exist in between the boundaries of the cities. The graph on the right shows the areas of the city of Tucson, Marana, Sahuarita, and Oro Valley. And you can see the significant areas which are not incorporated, what we call an unincorporated Pima County, that are not regulated by this part. Next slide, please. So I want to show you an example of the land use. On the pictures on the right, on the top, we have the remote sensing pictures, especially on the northwest part of Tucson. You can see either bare desert on the left and irrigation, which is mainly due to pumping irrigation at that time. And you can see that 26 years later, there are significant development. All of these are brand new developments. And again, we look to these different levels in our typology. Next, please. So in conclusion, and hopefully I'm not taking too much time, we need to do this in which we need to connect water with urban development at different relevant levels. So the important message for us is we cannot just consider the area as a whole to look at the relation between water and urban development. Rather, we need to study at micro levels to be able to, excuse me, to make some policy recommendations. The other challenge is the distinction between surface water and groundwater. We need to do an integrated land and water management. And then there is this issue on the wildcat developments, which are sometimes inserted within the formal development, which are the urbanites and the leapfrog, and this wildcat development. And this water sustainability and governance has important, especially a climate change effect, because there is not only the precipitation will decline, but also the partition of precipitation between the snow and rainfall will have impact, and that will allow to do that. The drought that we have now has not been seen for more than 500 years. Next slide, please. Well, there was one slide. In any event, it's almost my time. So thank you for your attention. I want to point out my colleagues, Dr. Graciela Snyder-Madanes, Engineer Edward Curley, and Professor Thomas Maddock, which are collaborators on this project. Thank you.
Yeah, merci beaucoup, Juan.
Thank you very much, Juan, also for keeping your time allocated. Thank you very much for that. This will allow for more time for questions and answers if there are any at the end. I will now hand the floor to the second speaker, who is Deepika Jawari. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing the name perfectly right. She's the main architect at an architect research studio based in New Delhi, India. And she's going to tell us about the impact of urban growth on groundwater resources in the case of Delhi in India. You have the floor. Thank you.
Do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah, the PowerPoint, perfect.
Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. So next slide. Next slide, please. So let's begin by picturing a part of the megacity of Delhi in the photo on the top, with probably nice buildings and few open spaces. And here all looks good, but in actual, the megacity of Delhi is reeling under the pressures of unplanned urban growth marked by rapid urbanization, burgeoning population, and climate change. One such issue is the scarcity of water, which is compensated by the extraction of groundwater. As can be seen in the picture in the bottom right, wherein the residents of an informal settlement scramble to get some share of water for their daily use from the water tankers that extract the groundwater. So this study aims to analyze the spatio-temporal characteristics of urban growth to understand its impact on the groundwater resources in Delhi. So I'll begin today's presentation by a brief introduction to the study area of Delhi, further explaining the groundwater situation that is there in Delhi, moving on to explaining the framework of the study under which urban growth was analyzed, finally concluding the presentation. Next slide, please. So the megacity of Delhi, which is one of the largest urban agglomerations, has an area of around 1,483 square kilometers and an estimated population of around 21 million inhabitants as of 2019. The groundwater availability in the territory is governed by the hydrogeological conditions characterized by distinct physiographic units which influence the groundwater occurrence, as can be seen in the map over here. The urban growth of Delhi is a combination of planned and unplanned developments with varying population densities within its historical, new, and redeveloping areas. It is also interesting to note that over 50% of Delhi resides in its various types of informal settlements. Next. So it is also important to understand the existing groundwater situation that is there in Delhi under the two parameters of quantity and quality. So the water demand in 2019 for Delhi was of about 1,260 million gallons per day. However, the Delhi Jal Board, the government agency responsible for water supply and sanitation, could provide only 937 million gallons, of which 86 million gallons came from groundwater itself. Thus, there was a 25% deficit in the water supply. Thus, groundwater accounts for almost 9% of Delhi's formal water supply. Yet the stage of groundwater extraction as of 2017 was of 120%. That is, extraction was more than the replenishment. This was mainly because the areas that were not adequately served by the Delhi Jal Board, the residents over there used private and illegal bore wells to extract groundwater for their demand. Also, the groundwater quality is deteriorating every year due to over-extraction. As per the Central Groundwater Board in 2019, the districts of Southwest and Northwest, which account for almost 32% of the total area of Delhi, have high electrical conductivity and salinity. There are also high fluoride and nitrate concentrations in many other regions, making the groundwater unsuitable for potable uses. These dynamic changes in quantity and quality of groundwater within the megacity, along with rampant urban growth, make Delhi an ideal case for understanding the impact of urban growth on its groundwater resource. Next. So this slide shows the basic framework of the study. So to understand the groundwater situation in the megacity of Delhi, data from primary and secondary sources were analyzed under 3 parameters. First, of urbanization, second, population, and third being climate. Next. So under the first aspect of urbanization, land use, land cover change, and type of settlements were studied. So the urbanized area of Delhi has expanded more than 5 times. And the figure over here shows the correlation between land use, land cover change, and the groundwater table in Delhi for the years of 2001, 2011, and 2017. It was observed that the built percentage of the city has significantly increased from 29% to 51% from 2001 to 2017. An overall comparison shows the decrease in the water table in the areas with the increased built-up area due to the increasing impermeable surfaces which impede the groundwater recharge. For example, in the area of Dwarka in the southwest part of Delhi, the groundwater table fell from 5 to 10 meters below ground level to 20 to 40 meters below ground level by the year 2017. Thus, every land use decision practice affects the environment and has a water resource footprint, which further impacts the groundwater resource below. Next. Type of settlement. So 75% of Delhi is urban. There is a proliferation of built structures, both informal and formal, due to the rapid urbanization. Rapid urbanization has also induced lifestyle changes which shift with the shift from primary to secondary and tertiary sectors. The shortage of water supply and intermittent daily water supply is worsened by inequity in supply, which varies spatially amongst the area's socioeconomic status. Thus, the inhabitants resort to alternate options for procuring their water, like buying water from the Delhi Jal Board or private water tankers, which mostly illegally abstract groundwater. There have been cases of water theft by the less affluent, and also there are private illegal abstraction by drilling bore wells. All this has put immense pressure on the groundwater resources because of its straightforward availability and cheaper overall operational costs. Next. So coming to the second aspect of urban growth, that is population, under which growth and population density was studied. Now, Delhi has a decadal growth rate of about 20% from 2001 to 2011. The correlation between water demand supply gap with the increasing population can be seen in the chart over here. The increase in the water demand is at the same rate of the population growth, but the state has unfortunately not been able to keep up with the supply. There is a decline, although there is a decline in the formal usage of groundwater due to the less demand in the irrigation sector and improved access to piped water supply. Unofficial extraction of groundwater continues as observed during the field survey to bridge the demand and supply gap. Next. The second aspect of population is density. So Delhi has a density of about 14,000 persons per square kilometer as of 2011. The analysis shows that 7 out of the 15 overexploited groundwater assessment units in Delhi had a population density of over 20,000 persons per square kilometer. Now, the increased population density relates to the concentration of demand within the area. Thus, the area dependent on the groundwater tends to deplete the source aquifer at a faster rate. Next. The third aspect studied was of climate. Now, Delhi faces the challenge of variability in its weather pattern and the potential for extreme events with increased urban growth and urbanized lifestyle. There has been an overall rise in the mean summer temperature as observed by the India Meteorological Department. Land use, land cover changes by replacing vegetation by the built areas have led to an average increase of 10 degrees Celsius in the last 15 to 17 years. This has hastened the evapotranspiration rates and increased the overall water demand. Now, Delhi's rainfall is also highly variable with a deficit of around 25% to a surplus of 90% from average. This deficit leads to frequent and prolonged periods of low groundwater levels. Increased precipitation with heavy spells leads to low infiltration rates of groundwater and its recharge. As groundwater aquifers are mainly recharged by the precipitation or through interaction with the surface water bodies, changes in the rainfall pattern greatly affect the groundwater systems below. Next. So this chart over here shows that in the year 2014, there was a deficit of around 34% in the average rainfall, which led to a significant drop in the groundwater recharge. Next. So to conclude, the research analyzed the impact of urban growth on groundwater resources in the megacity of Delhi under urbanization, population, and climate. Rapid and haphazard urban growth has negatively affected the groundwater resources in Delhi, affecting its overall sustainability. Most of the regions of the megacity of Delhi come under overexploited zone with an abstraction rate of over 100%. The prime reasons for groundwater extraction by legal and mostly illegal sources were identified as demand more than supply, inequity in water distribution, intermittent supply, and low pressure of water supply. Not only quantity, but quality is also an emerging concern for the various stakeholders. Thus, to make a substantial difference in the current approach, there needs to be an holistic approach towards the groundwater resources, concerning multiple contexts of first governance and management, wherein there is a need to deal with the multiplicity of agencies, have a control over the water tanker mafia and illegal extraction. Secondly, in terms of design, planning, and conservation, where we can have more water efficient design, nature-based solutions, and blue-green infrastructure planning. Thirdly, there is a need for awareness and sensitization amongst the various stakeholders for mindful use of resources. There is also a need for technological upgradations to prevent pilferage and transmission losses. And also important is to update the usage records for proper planning and analysis of groundwater resources. Thus, even though urban growth is imperative, a holistic approach can aid in reducing the pressure on the groundwater resources like groundwater resources. Next. Thank you for your attention. This was it from me.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup de cette...
Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you as well for having stuck to the time that was allotted to you, which will leave us, I hope, a lot more time for exchange in the end between us, or Q&A if there are any questions. So thank you very much for this presentation, which does show the difficulties that you encounter already and which will undoubtedly worsen in the future. I'd like to now give the floor to Mr. Jose Maria Riguera, who is the National Director for Drinking Water Sanitation at the Ministry of Public Works in Argentina. And he will be talking to us about economic evaluation of health and environmental pollution costs caused by the non-connection of housings to urban sanitation networks in peri-urban areas in Argentina. You have the floor, sir.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I present my paper, Economic Evaluation of Health and Environmental Pollution Cost caused by the no connection of housing to urban sanitation networks in peri-urban areas in Argentina. I did this work together with Fabian Sicari. Next one. Okay, in Latin American sanitation system still have limitation for housing to get secure access to the urban sanitation network for the no connection of housing to the sewer network. This work was developed in San Jose Obrero neighborhood. That is an informal settlement located in Lanús district, that is the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires in Argentina. The main objective was to evaluate the economic cost that can be avoided in health and maintenance of cesspit if the problem of lack of connection is resolved. We use quantitative and qualitative techniques like open interview, surveys, and sampling of household effluent in the street, in the public street. The data obtained were analyzed under the environmental economic approach. The two variables that we considered were cases of diarrhea and cesspit maintenance. Next one. Okay, in the upper right picture, you see the sewer network in that place. And in the other picture, you see the no connection of housing to the sewer network. For your information, in the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires lives more than 13 million of inhabitants, and 57% of them don't have sewage, 57% of them has sewage coverage. It affects especially to the settlement that we have more than 1,000 settlements in this area. So the expansion of the service, of the sewage service, not necessarily guarantee the connection of houses. ARCEAU, that is the biggest company of water and sanitation in Buenos Aires, showed that in some studies showed that in vulnerable areas in Buenos Aires, the no connection is around 40%. Next one. Okay, here you see Buenos Aires City in the center, and then the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, and the urban expansion, the direction of urban expansion, followed by the expansion of the sewage network. In blue point is the settlement San Jose Obrero that we made this study, this paper. Next one. Okay, the socioeconomic cost associated to the no connection have different implications. One is the cesspit maintenance that the family has to do. The other is the public health associated with the diarrhea cases. The other is environmental pollution of the groundwater running to the street, to the groundwater, to the river, and others that we don't study in this paper, but like contamination of aquifer, degradation of the urban environment, diffuse contamination, etc. In the picture, you see the sewer connection, the sewer network and the no connection. For example, you see the sewer network and wastewater running in the street, going to the river or going to the groundwater. We made field survey. We made 100 surveys in 3 months, and then the data systematization of these 100 surveys. Next one. We have observed in this study, in this field work, and in this survey, there are 3 types of technologies of no connection. The first one is that the black water or the primary drain goes to the cesspit, and the secondary drain means the gray water going to the street, to the storm drain. The other one is the black water going to the sewage and the gray water going to the storm drain. And the last one is the black water and gray water going to the cesspit and then to the sewer, but without blending the cesspit. Next one. Result of this study. Okay, it's important to show that 70% of the people, of the household, are not connected to the network, to the sewage drains. We ask to the family why they don't connect, and they say that a big percentage, they say that they don't connect because they don't know the availability of the network. Okay. People don't know that the network or the sewage network is in the street. It's strange, but it was like this. And the second important reason is that economic difficulties, because family has to pay the connection to the sewer drain. The other results. Next one. Okay, 78% of the household effluent go to the cesspit. So 78% are connected to the cesspit. We ask to the frequency of cesspit maintenance, and we evaluate with the survey that the frequency of maintenance is 1.2 times a year. It means that the homes, the family require the atmospheric tank or atmospheric track service each 6 months. Each 9 months a year. Next one. About diarrhea cases, we ask to every family, and we divide it in 3 items. Cases of diarrhea in children under 5 years, cases of diarrhea in children between 5 and 15, and cases of diarrhea over 15 years old. We evaluate and we finish the study that the proportion of diarrhea cases for the total population considered in this study were 12.7%. Okay, next one. Finally, we evaluate externalities. We made 2 studies, the base scenario and the superior scenario. The base scenario is the real situation that 30% of the people are connected to the network, to the sewage network. And the superior scenario is all people are connected to the sewer network. So for the health cost for both scenarios, we evaluate the cost of travel to the doctor, each person with illness, the cost to travel to the doctor, the medical consultation, the treatment of illness, and the loss of work day. For the cesspit maintenance, we use the cost of atmospheric tank times the annual frequency for both scenarios, 30% of connection and the total people connected to the network. So if we got that the annual cost avoided is 3 million of pesos per year. Next one. Finally, we conclude in this study that we have in Argentina a lot of settlements with self-management of sanitation. In this case, in San Jose Obrero settlement, they are with 40-year or self-management of sanitation. The associated diarrhea rate is 12%. The health cost is 7.2% of the total cost, and the cesspit maintenance cost is 92.8% of the total cost. And the liquid present in the public roads are domestic contamination, because we made BOD and COD of this liquid, and is domestic contamination. The general conclusion of this study is that this work allowed to quantify the economic benefits to be connected, and the maintenance of cesspit is higher in cost than the health cost. An extrapolation of this work can be done at national level in Argentina to define a new approach to the public policies for the sanitation system in 4,400 slum and suburbs we call barrios populares in Argentina. In Argentina, 4 million of people live in slum and suburbs that we call barrios populares, without water and without formal sanitation. Also, this study can be used in most countries in Latin America that have the same problem. It means large number of informal settlement plus lack of connection to the sewers train. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. This is my mail if you want to ask questions in the near future.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. And I will say to you, like I said to your colleagues, thank you for being so fast and respecting the time. I hope that the questions are building up. But I do not see them on the screen, but maybe the technical support can tell us if spectators and participants have been sending in questions, so that maybe we can prepare for the question and answers session, which will be coming up. We now move on to the fourth and last speaker, Jacques Lolive, who's Director of Research at the CNRS, National Center for Scientific Research in France, and he will be presenting the work of his colleague Cynthia Okamura, who herself works for the Sao Paulo government in Brazil. The topic of their joint presentation is the experimentation of a participatory and integrated management policy to handle irregular occupations in the Guarapiranga Reservoir watershed in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Mr. Lolive, the floor is yours.
Bonjour. Alors, je suis très heureux de participer à la conférence.
Good morning. Very happy to participate in this international conference. I'm going to present a research underway on irregular occupation in protected areas around drinking water reservoir in Sao Paulo in Brazil. I'm going to be talking about a subject which is quite close to the one that Jose Maria Guerra presented to you. Research is carried out with my colleague Cynthia Okamura, the agency, health agency in Sao Paulo. Next. So in introduction, the irregular occupations increase has caused a significant environmental degradation in the metropolitan region of Sao Paulo, because the population in precarious situations illegally occupy the protected natural areas, such as the one surrounding the Guarapiranga Basin water reservoir, threatening the water supply, the quality rather, that supplies approximately 20% of the region, about 4 million people. To advance towards a resolution, so to speak, of this problematic, the organization proposes, in collaboration with the Pact of Laboratory of CNRS and subsidized with the FAP-ESP of Sao Paulo Research Foundation. The goal is to, along with the residents and concerned institutions, to have a action program for a participatory and integrated management in 2 pilot areas at the Guarapiranga hydrographic basin. This participatory and integrated management of the hydrographic basin of the Guarapiranga Reservoir is a specific water policy whose purpose is to handle the intricate problem of the irregular occupation in wellspring protected areas. Now, how do you define the methodology? The first step is to answer to 4 questions which are described below. 1, how do you analyze the problem of irregular occupation in the hydrographic basin of Guarapiranga? To comprehend the power of this socio-metropolitan phenomenon, we formulate the assumption that irregular occupation constitute an interest networking which is difficult to transform. 2, how do you handle this complex issue? We defined a participatory and integrated management policy of the Guarapiranga hydrographic basin, whose uniqueness lies in the fact that there's an irregular occupation problem, leading to specific action which aims at sustainable and participatory land holding regularization. Thirdly, how do you define and implement this water policy? We are carrying out an action research based on pragmatism to experiment the viability conditions of this policy. 4, how to experiment the specific and innovative water policy? We propose a pragmatic modeling that will be based on the lessons brought by the sociology of innovation. Each one of these answers has allowed us to define a stage in the methodology that we will present to you now. Next, please. So the first step in the methodology, analyzing the irregular occupations as an interest network or networking. Irregular occupations form an interest networking that associates very distinct actors in accordance with 4 categories of independent but coordinated actions that align the actors' interests to different at the beginning and stabilize the network. One is the lack of housing policies that causes irregular occupations. 2, market profitability of illegal allotments based on the possibility of capturing anticipated appreciation arising from the regularization intervention. 3, there's an anticipation, if you like, of all the advantages brought by putting in place the network. Second. 3rd, principle of right to housing for impoverished populations, which promotes the regularization of occupations, regardless of the occupied areas, and justifies the complacent law, so to speak. 4, electoral patronage strategies that stimulate the irregular occupations that politicians exchange, so to speak, for voices. The interest networking is organized according to the following problematization: the irregular occupations in the protected environmental areas are a solution to the housing problems of the impoverished populations. Next. Methodology 2, we are now going to see how we can actually define a specific water policy to handle the irregular occupations problem. There are 5 characteristics. 1 is placing the Guarapiranga hydrographic basin at the core of our new policy, since it continues to be the object of several appropriations and modifications to support many human objectives. 2, carrying out an integrated management of the basin, which would coordinate different public action and articulate several sector policies. That goes through setting up a forum of institutions, a mechanism of partnerships that brings together different institutions. They're not used to talking to each other, but the advantage is that they will be put together and discuss their different points of view, which is something that really works. Thirdly, putting in place a participatory process that will accompany the definition and the implementation of the new policy, relying on another forum, that is a forum of the inhabitants, of the residents, which will be made up of the population representatives and community leaders. We will, of course, use this scientific and technical expertise because that is an important dimension. And finally, the need for learning, cognitive and practical learning work. For this, we will put in place an experimental mechanism, the pragmatic modeling, that will allow us to identify solutions and experiment transformative actions at the scale of pilot areas. Next, please. The third step of our methodology leads to action research, which is based on pragmatism. Now, we carried out an action research to experiment the viability of this policy. Action research is a process in which the social actors conduct research with the cooperation and support of professional researchers. The researcher learns from the experience of the actors, and the actors, the different stakeholders, learn with the researchers' methodologies and techniques. This attitude suits us. However, we connect it to enhance it, the social sciences researchers' pragmatist attitude of commitment. This is typical of Dewey, one of the authors, with the society transformation process. Instead of examining the correlation with adjustment between a theory and a defined study object rigid in the present, the researcher contributed to the reciprocal transformation of the theory, and in the field, it requires a researcher's engagement in the course of development. In short, our research is an action research, a compromise between the proposal resulting from theoretical analysis and the possibilities of actions offered by the quality of partnership and participation that we will organize in the pilot areas. Next, please. Methodology 4, I'm going to present what is this pragmatic modeling. It is something that has 3 steps. So one is classic in the modeling, simplification of the studied phenomenon to enable intervention. So it describes a network of key actors and its action logics that participate in the phenomenon production with performance and transformation hypotheses. The second stage is establishment of an interaction plan. For example, the participatory forums, partnership forums. These interactions will allow us to simulate the more complex interrelations of the society, which will allow us to experiment the transformations within the model. And we use different transformation levers: participation, partnership, environmental education, and social technology, all the levers that allow us to transform the behaviors of people. Third dimension or stage is the small-scale experimentation in pilot areas representing a more complex territory. With this, we'll be able to analyze the context effects in action. We have chosen 2 highly contrasted pilot areas, both located in Paris, extreme south of the city of Sao Paulo, to contextualize our program of action. Next. I'm going to now present the first results of this research. The first result is that we were able to define the recent history of irregular occupation in Guarapiranga. Since 80s, we've got 3 periods. The first period is the left-wing mobilization, important growth of social movements supported by the Workers' Party, the PT, and other left-wing organizations during the 1980s, which was translated into a peak of irregular occupations of land in 1989 and 1990. Since 1994, there's been a second period, a second peak of irregular occupations, but this time the social and space dynamics are different. The occupations are done in protected areas and natural areas, and there's a new strategy which is very sophisticated, which is going to allow englobing the owners, the land grabbers who grab land and sell the land to the poor. So land grabbers, and we'll also have associations of residents that are false resident associations, because these are actually real estate agents disguised as an organized social movement. Now, since the beginning of our research, and this brings me to 2018-2019, we've been seeing the rise of the first capital command, La Primeiro Comando da Capital, PCC, the first criminal organization in Brazil. These criminals are attracted by the high profitability of the irregular allotment market. The entry of PCC marks a brutal acceleration in the irregular occupation process, since this new actor avails of a financial capacity which is high, an organizational capacity as well, and the power of imposing by force. So all these characteristics are much more important than the previous actors. The observations in the field, confirmed by testimonies, guide us to the assumption that the PCC would become like an integrated promoter, a sole interlocutor that develops a real economic sector of irregular allotments and occupations. Next. Other results, the preliminary results of our research, we've analyzed regulations regarding the Guarapiranga region area. We found two interesting things. One, when we discussed with the SIAAP people, that is a municipal housing department, analyzing the legislation, we realized that we had a cycle that was repeating itself. Every time the legislation wants to enact new rules for urban development, and at the same time as the production of this legislation, it is associated with an amnesty for previous buildings. Now, this is a cycle that's going to be reproduced because there'll be a new legislation that will update the rules and which will create a new amnesty for the previous developments. So irregular developments, constructions are legitimized as we go along. Another diagnosis result refers to the regularization reset as a process of progressive irreversibilization. That means that when you actually look at the modus operandi of the irregular operation, its division, occupation, etc., by residents, we can consider that all these steps will constitute a process that whereby the process becomes irreversible. So the construction of the housing, even if it's precarious and temporary, the fact that's inhabited, once this phase is achieved, you can't change anything, then the occupation becomes legitimized. Next, please. Research is being put in place. We've put in place the experimental mechanism. We've chosen the pilot areas. 2 pilot areas were selected, and they correspond to a combination of hydrographic subbasins, that of the Kolim River hydrographic basin. They're responsible for a large part of the pollution of the reservoir, 10.5%. We've launched the Forum of Institutions in 2019 in June to promote discussion amongst the different administrations, the SITEB, SEBESP, the State and Municipal Department of Housing, Health and Environment, Public Ministry, Environmental, etc. All these stakeholders met, they discussed, and they're interested by the implementation of integrated management in the pilot areas. We also launched the Forum of the Residents that kicked off in February 2020, gathering all the community leaders, about 50 of them in our field of study. Now, the community leaders are also the representatives of irregular occupations, but once they are consolidated and regularized, which is closest to the city, downtown centers. Conclusion, I presented a research which is not complete, but the objective of this article was to present an approach that enables the increase of viability for water policies, especially in complex situations like this one. We're looking at eco-centered because they're on the watershed, concentrated on the watershed. Even if it's incomplete, we've detected some conditions which are favorable. First of all, we advise putting in place action research that combines the expertise of the researcher and that of the technicians. And we believe that it is important to have a collective experimentation to actually promote learning for the decision makers and the partners of the implementation. It is fundamental to put in place a partnership and participatory mechanism to define and implement this policy, and to consider the water policy as an innovative project, a weak project that needs allies to be put in place. This is inspired from the sociology of innovation of Bruno Latour. Once the experimentation will be finished in the pilot zone, the project will be pursued in other subbasins of Guarapiranga. What is the idea? Our objective with this research is to operationalize the results of the action research to translate them into administrative standards, which will be implemented by the CETESP, which is the environmental agency, which is a huge structure which enacts laws, applies them, controls them. So with the support of the CETESP, we will be able to transform the situation in the entire zone of the Guarapiranga basin, and the aim is to have a research in social sciences which would transform urban policies. Next. Well, thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much to our four speakers of this morning, and with their presentations, which were very diverse and particularly interesting. I would now like to turn towards the public. We must be about 30 participants in our session this morning, in order to remind them that, of course, they can ask questions to the speakers going through the chat. All you need to do is to click on it's either the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on when you're on the computer or your iPad, and you have more with the possibility of accessing the discuss function, and in the chat function, leave your messages. So for the moment, we only have one question that has come to us.
From Annie Genibert. Questions being directed to the presentation by Jose Maria Regueira on the economic evaluation of environmental pollution costs in Argentina. So she's asking, I don't understand why in Argentina the sanitation costs are higher than health costs. Maintenance costs are higher than health costs. I'm not sure I understood. Thank you for answering my question. So that's directed to Jose Maria Regueira. If you're still online, can you answer this question, Jose? And then
in the chat, but it's like for this study, the cost of maintenance of cesspit is higher than the diarrhea cost. It's because it's very expensive in Argentina to call and to pay for the atmospheric tank or atmospheric truck, and each family has to pay for these services. And people have to, each 9 months, they have to call to the service, and it's very expensive. Also for illness or for diarrhea, we use the cost of travel to the doctor, the medical consultation, the treatment of illness, and the loss of work day. But we use only 1 day of illness, no more than 1 day. We didn't study the hospitalization cost in case of they have to go to the hospital, and the mortality cost associated, no, in this case. But also it was interesting to show that when the people, the family called to the atmospheric tank, to the service, they gave 2 options to the families. Because we call to the service. They say, when you want with this price, we took the wastewater without treatment, and with other price, with treatment. What do you want? With treatment or without treatment? It's terrible, no? Okay, people have to pay, of course, not too expensive. But in this study, the cost of maintenance of cesspit was higher than the diarrhea cost.
Voilà, je ne vois pas d'autres questions. Alors, je vous propose.
I don't see any other questions, so maybe the 4 panelists, 4 speakers may have questions to ask each other. Is there anything that one of you said that might have given you a question to ask each other? Maybe this will give a bit more time to the public, the participants, to send us some questions. We have more than 15 minutes ahead of us for questions and answers, so plenty of time. So maybe we can start internally. Do you have questions for your colleagues? So, one of you has to raise their hand and ask the first question. I don't see any, but then I have a question for all of you, actually, for the four of you. My impression with things you've described to us, there's a tremendous lack of governance is what I feel, whether it be at the federal central level or at the local authorities level. There's a laissez-faire, they're letting people who are suffering from, poverty, or just because it's always easier not to follow the rules, they let them not follow the rules. There are examples in all four countries you've told us about. There are water laws, urbanization laws. So how can you explain this lack of power, or this lack of willingness to enforce the rules of urbanization and enforce the regulations and the control over what people do, so that we avoid these types of situations? Is there any of you who'd like to answer this question? Yes, I can answer. For informal dwellings, well, in Brazil, there is no social housing policy. So in a way, the policies are very liberal, and so the poorest don't have access or cannot have access to the housing market because it's too prohibitive. So rather than financing social housing policy, they will just let be the informal housing and then accompany them. So once people have settled somewhere in a restricted zone or protected zone, they will then provide the services, which still ends up costing less than having a social housing policy. So in a way, the Brazilian government, in a very hypocritical way, has left it up to informal settlements to lead the social housing effort, and then they just come after and bring the other public services. Okay, which then leads to a land revenues for illegal occupants once their settlements have been legitimized. This gives them opportunity, economic benefits. Yes. The price of the land before the price of the land is affected by this informal settlement, because there's a lot of money to be made on selling, barren land, anticipating that there will be informal settlements later built on the land, so that affects the price. Yeah. Okay, that's a very pragmatic way of approaching things, which it's not exactly optimal in terms of urbanization and improvement and expansion of collective services. Okay, so the questions are arriving. So UNESCO is telling me. Question for speakers.
Pour vos 4 régions, donc dans 8 ans, quels sont les principaux problèmes qui doivent être...
So by 2030, in your 4 respective regions, what are the issues that need to be tackled by, well, I suppose by public authorities? Maybe you can head back to Tucson, Arizona, where clearly urban growth is going to face a lack of resources in surface water and groundwater, like you explained it to us really well earlier, Mr. Valdez. How much more urban growth is possible at all in areas such as Arizona, where water is probably the most limiting factor of urban development, as a solution to keep going further to fetch those resources. There's the project of canal connecting to the Rio Colorado, but as we've been hearing, it's been depleted. So can we go on like this in this geopolitical and ecological context? Are the resources here to guarantee an access to water to the populations of these areas, or should we just not curb this urban growth? Mr. Valdez, the floor is yours.
If you can at least summarize the question so I can try to answer.
Summarize. Yeah, just to say, in Tucson, it's clear that you are facing a problem of scarcity. Scarcity with the flow of surface water, which is decreasing, and also the level of the aquifers, which are also decreasing. So at that moment, could you allow, if it is possible to control, the growing of the populations, and also in parallel the growing of their consumptions of water, without, as you are not on the littoral. If you are on the littoral, it could be easy to create a desalination stations, a plant. So in the Colorado area, it's not so easy. And I saw a project of big canal to take water from the Colorado River, but it seems that at this moment, not in the future, Colorado is also very dry at some seasons. So how do you manage the increasing of the populations when the water resources are so rare, in fact? Is it by controlling the growing of the population? Is it by controlling the consumption of each one? Or do you imagine to prepare the future, mainly in the context of climate change?
Yeah, like I said, the consumption per capita and per household in Tucson has been declining, or in the, let me say, in the Arizona Sun Corridor. So there is some optimism that we're still using more water per capita than in some cities in Europe. The second issue is that 50% of the water in Arizona is devoted to agriculture. So, and the other issue is the legal rights that the Native American nation have, the cities, the agriculture. The SIAAP canal was built mainly to supply water for agriculture, but when they found the cost of that water, the agriculture decided to continue pumping from the aquifer. So that water is now mainly due to use for water supply. So I think that the Tucson Water Authority, which is called Tucson Water, and the other entities throughout the region are doing conservation plans. The US Bureau of Reclamation did a very comprehensive study in 2012, in which they studied all the sources of supply and all the sources of demand. And for example, you mentioned desalination, and desalination was one issue, was desalination from the sea, which of course will be very expensive to bring it to Arizona, but also the use of brackish water. And still the prices are still very large. So I think the measures for Tucson mainly are conservation, reduction of consumption per capita, and some incentives, for example, financing new toilets, new water supply, the elimination of swimming pools, which is the trend that we have now in the Southwest, where the houses with pools is declining. So there's a lot of measures that can be done. And if this thing continues, then there is hope. But at the same time, the droughts that we are having, and doesn't seem to be an ending, we may have to cut about 5% of the allocation to Tucson, to Arizona, if the water in the Lake Mead goes below 1026 meters below sea level. So the future is not great, and we'll have to do some very serious cuts in the water supply. How do we allocate those cuts? And that is what I mentioned, the 500 plus plan, which Arizona is trying to reduce 500,000 acre feet of water. And the Phoenix is doing that. Also, Nevada is participating with money. And the idea how to compensate the people are cutting, voluntary cutting the water.
So thank you very much. For Deepika, I have also a question of Mr. Abdoulaye Cissé. Do you have the French translation in English for you?
Yes, I require English translation.
You have it. So, Monsieur Cissé demande.
So do you have interpretation?
I need it. I need to hear in English, yeah.
Okay. You may answer the question? I do not know if you have the translation. So, he would like to ask you, how in urgency you may manage the water demand in Delhi, and what is the system, the today system of water management in this area?
Okay, so in times of emergency, the water supply is mainly through the water tankers that are provided by either the municipal corporation or the private water supply tankers, which obviously they tend to extract groundwater from the land. And the current water management system is such that most of the areas are, although having municipal supply, but there are almost, I think, 17% of the region of Delhi does not have access to piped supply. So in case of emergencies, these areas are first catered by the water tankers, and the other areas also, if there is emergency, the neighboring states are asked for to supply water if there is like a drastic shortage in the groundwater as well. Yeah.
Moi, ce qui me semble dans beaucoup de cas, c'est que effectivement, il est très difficile.
It seems to me that in a lot of cases, it is complicated to control the population in its water consumption, in its wastewater disposal, and also in where they settle for their dwellings, which sometimes happens outside of the urban boundaries and the authorized areas. So is this situation, is this lack of control on the behavior of people going to lead to what being told about climate change and impacts on water resources? Is this going to lead to more and more serious crises and to the following of these types of policy? Who can answer? Well, in the case of São Paulo, we're heading towards a water crisis extremely fast. There is informal housing being built around the reservoirs, and they usually happen without any sanitation services, so the quality of water is going to worsen. The quality of the water is going to be degraded. We also know there's going to be a lot of problems linked to climate change, such as warmer summers. We're also aware that the water management is still too technocratic in Sao Paulo. Populations aren't involved, and so they're not interested in the question. So that's just going to lead to a water crisis over water crisis. Yes, it's true. In crises in Brazil and in other countries have already been happening. in my work, I've been following the questions of droughts in Sao Paulo that happened, I think 3-4 years ago. Yeah, 3 years ago. 3 years ago, then the same thing happened in Brasilia. So it's really a recurring problem now, those water crises. Clearly, the federal government is encouraging the creating of basin authorities to launch a dialogue between stakeholders, but progress is very slow, especially when the cities use different basins. It's the case in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, where most of the water comes from the Piracicaba basin. So the overarching issue is really a governance one, when it's still they're not finding any solutions. That's true in many places. I mean, I would assume that in Arizona, the freedom of choice or the freedom of use of groundwater is almost a constitutional freedom, and it's hard to regulate. I would assume it's the same thing in India, and the population's behavior and regulation is also relevant in Argentina. So my previous question was about 2030, so that's 8 years. Can we imagine some policies being implemented to find solutions to these major issues? Who can answer that? We've lost a chunk of our participants. 26 of them, where are they? Maybe Deepika, for India, how do you see things evolving so that the situation maybe gets better, and so the governance gets better?
Yeah, so with respect to Delhi, I can say, so we are under the preparation or almost prepared a new master plan for Delhi, the 2041 plan. So under which one aspect that is being covered is the blue-green infrastructure planning, which tends to, compensate for what has been lost in terms of the water resources and the other environmental resources, so to say. Like Delhi has a vast network of water bodies and open green spaces. So in the coming years, not just 2030, I would say, but even beyond, we would be trying to look into enhancing the blue-green infrastructure to further augment the natural resources, water resource as well, one aspect of which is this. And then further, the government is looking into increasing the piped municipal supply to various regions within Delhi. For example.
Merci beaucoup. Je vois que l'heure tourne et finalement il va être maintenant.
Thank you very much. I see that we're almost out of time. It's 10:30 in Paris. Bruno, I will hand the floor back to you after thanking our 4 panelists for their very interesting presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Jean-François, merci. Thank you, Jean-François. Thank you to our speakers for their excellent presentations. Please stay online with us. This brings to a close our first morning session, and after the break that will be till 11, we will be coming together for 3 new parallel sessions. The first one on the governance modalities, the second on the strengthening of sustainable solidarities, and the third on the objectives of sustainable development and the continuity of services. Thank you very much to everybody.
Notre époque connaît des changements sans précédent. L'activité humaine augmente, les villes s'étendent. Aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, l'eau a besoin de nous. Le traitement de l'eau, c'est notre responsabilité. Une histoire d'hommes, de femmes, faite d'engagement et de savoir-faire. C'est notre histoire au SIAAP. Nous collectons, transportons et dépolluons les eaux usées de 9 millions de franciliens. Notre réseau de 440 km de canalisation est géré en temps réel, avec des outils de prévision et de régulation qui nous permettent d'anticiper toutes les situations et d'optimiser la gestion des flux. 7 jours sur 7, 24 heures sur 24. Chaque jour, dans nos usines, nous traitons 2,5 millions de mètres cubes d'eau usée. Grâce à un savoir-faire et des équipements uniques en Europe. Notre vision est durable, tournée vers le long terme. Nous nous engageons à développer notre activité industrielle de manière responsable. Nous investissons régulièrement dans la modernisation de nos usines et dans le développement de solutions innovantes et protectrices de l'environnement. Chacun de nous, dans son métier, se sent porteur du service public et de l'intérêt général, au service de notre mission, la préservation du milieu naturel et de la biodiversité. Au SIAAP, nous sommes fiers d'être une entreprise publique forte de 40 ans d'expérience au service de l'agglomération parisienne. Et nous sommes plus de 1700 agents à partager cet engagement et cette passion. Pour aujourd'hui et pour demain.